Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is author, lecturer, and historian of the African diaspora, Carroll C.R. Gibbs. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you for inviting me.
So you are a historian of some renown locally, nationally, and internationally, as well as the author and co-author of 6 books. And you started an African history and cultural lecture series in 1989. That's 30 years ago. And I'm so impressed looking at the schedule you have coming up in 2019. And, you know, throughout the evening, I hope you'll talk about some of the upcoming lectures that people might be interested in attending.
I'd certainly be happy to do that.
So tonight's subject is Jamestown, the 400th anniversary, relevance, reflections, myths, and truths. And a timely subject as the radio waves are full of people like Joshua Johnson talking about the New York Times Magazine's 1619 Project. And this is acknowledging the 400th anniversary of enslaved Africans being brought to the colonies through Jamestown, Virginia. I think a lot of writers and lecturers and historians like yourself are trying to shed light on what most Americans have never understood about slavery, about African slavery, and how it has impacted what we're experiencing now, today, in this country.
I was quite surprised this morning to hear that Oprah's friend Gail had never heard of 1619.
Oh, wow.
But I suppose that's true for most folks. They don't seem to understand. And at the same time, as they learn more about the importance of the arrival of 20 and odd Africans at Jamestown, there is a danger in over-focusing on that as the very first time that enslaved African people came into the Americas. So we want to tell it. We want to do a balanced retelling of the story, but at the same time, the clock doesn't start there. It is a continuation of a process that unfortunately had already risen its horrid head above the horizon. And what I mean, for example, is that by 1619, there were already roughly 500,000 enslaved Africans in the Americas already. The Spanish had brought a large number, and in fact, there were members of the group in 1526 that had made their presence felt in helping to stage one of the earliest of slave uprisings in what would come to be South Carolina. So there's in Bermuda, for example, there were already enslaved Africans in Bermuda. So this is not the time to overfocus, but to place Jamestown in perspective. And of course, we haven't even touched on the fact that there is evidence to suggest, and I touch on it in one of my books, Black Explorers, 2300 BC to the present, that it's just possible, Catherine, that Africans might have come to the Americas on their own. So there are a number of different ways to look at this. And I suppose the usefulness of 1619 is that it does provide, in a new and developing field of information, at least a central focus point, as long as we don't take that focus point out of context.
And you're right. I mean, slavery actually was not a new concept, and the enslavement of Africans was not a new concept. Reading Dr. Kindy's book, Stamped from the Beginning, he actually says the word slave came from Slav because some of the earliest slaves were from the Slavic countries. And I think you mentioned to me that Spain and Portugal also had slaves.
They were also involved in this before Jamestown. So when we understand that this was a, if you will, roiling enterprise that involved actually the world, and that Jamestown was at least at the beginning, a meager outpost. Jamestown, of course, grows, if you will, under some of the worst circumstances. We have the period of time called the Starving Time. Now, all of this is prior to 1619 and the arrival, but we have episodes of extraordinary cruelty, greed, and of course betrayal of Africans as well as the Native Americans. By the time that 1619 rolls around and the event occurs near the end of August, as John Ralph says, a Dutch man of war with 20 and odd Africans arrives, and essentially they trade these people for food. They need to hurry up and get out of there because these 20 and odd Africans were stolen from a slave ship on its way to Veracruz, Mexico. And these English, if you wish to call them pirates or privateers, then turn around and exit that part of the theater of conflict and wind up, one within a few days of the other, at a little place that we today call Hampton, Virginia.
And these Africans came from which country? Because that's the other thing. We tend to lump enslaved Africans as being this monolithic. They were African, but Africa's a continent, not a country. So the slaves that eventually came to the colonies came from all different kinds of countries, and they had all different kinds of civilizations, and they all had all different levels of sophistication in the countries from which they came from.
And the interesting thing here is that we believe the majority of the 20 or so came from the kingdom of Ndongo, not far from, for those who need a map reference, and I certainly would by this time, near Angola. And in fact, the kingdom was at war with the kingdom of Ndongo, and the kingdom of Congo was at war with the kingdom of Ndongo. Ndongo is an amazing country. It deserves to be much better known. Had a capital city called Kabasa of 50,000 people. And yet we have none of their names of the 20 or so. They finally show up in the English records with Portuguese names, those that show up at all in the first 70 years or 80 years or so of the existence of the Jamestown colony. And of course, Jamestown then sinks into insignificance in 1699 when the capital is transferred to Williamsburg. So we have this sort of perplexing problem of trying to unravel the names of people who would set the stage for a lot more people to come after them.
So for those of you who are just joining us here on Making Change Radio, I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we're talking with historian Carroll C.R. Gibbs here on Radio Fairfax. And we're talking about Jamestown here in this week where there's a lot of attention being paid to what we don't know, what Americans don't understand about the enslavement of Africans and how that has impacted our country from its very beginnings. And I think you make an excellent point here, too, about the fact that a lot happened from 1619 to 1699. One of the things that happened is that tobacco was discovered to be the gold of the Americas. And the only way to produce enough tobacco was to have people working those large tracts of land. It was a labor-intensive business. And so this became, enslaved Africans became the currency of this burgeoning economy, basically.
Indeed. And what we find is that along with sugar, for example, the British Empire is essentially built on the backs of enslaved Africans, as thousands and thousands and thousands of more are brought against their will, creating a narrative that is unique in that these are America's first, and indeed some would say only, involuntary immigrants. That the root story of America welcomed all of its immigrants, or in the case of the early Chinese who came to the West Coast, they called it Gum San Hoc, the Golden Mountain. It wasn't such a mountain, and it definitely wasn't gold for these involuntary African immigrants. And so our narrative cannot necessarily be neatly reconciled with what used to be the sort of Statue of Liberty a trope used by so many other people. And it is in that difference, it is in that space between narratives that we begin to, or at least we ought to, use as a lever to pry open those hidden corners of history and tell a difficult but necessary story of a certain part of America's upbringing.
You know, one of the callers into the 1A show that was the hour right before this show said that, you know, she came to this realization after reading the 1619 project that this country was built on slaveocracy, that the middle class today needs to look back and realize that our wealth, our inherited wealth going back generations, is based on slaveocracy. And I thought that was such an interesting way of trying to crystallize this concept of why we maintained this institution so long and fought the bloodiest war in the history of our country so that the southern states could maintain it.
One of the benefits of the 1619 project is to have people take a close-up look at just a few areas where we can directly trace the impact of African enslavement on American society. I mean, one of the reasons we don't have health care is because at the end of the Civil War, with the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, which, by the way, the full name of the Freedmen's Bureau is Refugees, Freedmen's, and Abandoned Lands, so that white people were helped too. But the idea that black people might be involved in the establishment of something that even if it benefited all Americans, there were enough Americans who did not want that to happen. We see it again in the development of American capitalism in advanced techniques of bookkeeping that were developed to keep track of what would be, by the time of the Civil War, 4 million enslaved black people. We see it again in the criminal justice system, where the violence that came as a result of forcibly enslaving hundreds of thousands, ultimately millions of people, bled into the penalties. And we see that directly when we look at the criminal justice system. So for a variety of major parts of the American system, we can see and we can trace their beginnings right back to this bloody, this terrible time in American history. And that is a difficult admission for a lot of people. And then to look at the wealth of contribution. If we take a look just at some of the amazing people, black folk with Virginia roots, I mean, we'd be looking at John Mercer Langston or Booker T. Washington or Doug Wilder or even the Olympic athlete Gabby Douglas. I mean, these are children of Virginia, but at the same time, the Old Dominion is the womb of American slavery and racial segregation. So we have to tell the story, as John Hope Franklin said, tell the unvarnished truth, and have dialogue and a way in which people can use this information to take a new and more penetrating and more honest look at the beginnings of this country and where we are today.
Well, I think Virginia's uniquely situated for many reasons. And I'm a native Virginian, and my family goes all the way back to Mannequin Town. They were French Huguenot refugees from France. But so we celebrated the establishment of the House of Burgesses. That also happened in 1619. And now, right on top of that, you know, the first enslaved recorded Africans came into this country at the same time. You know, you fast forward to the Civil War. Where was the capital of the Confederacy? Virginia. Where was the leader of the Confederate Army? Where was he from? Robert E. Lee, Virginia. We have more Confederate statues in Virginia than any other state in the United States. Why is that? Because Virginia is the cradle for many things. And I think that makes us uniquely positioned to talk in a different way about what has happened here. The history of Virginia really it overlays the history of everything else that happened in this country.
Indeed. We've been able, you made me think about my own family. I've done a little genealogy on my father's side, and I know that I have the paperwork to go back at least as far as 1790. And as I look at those folks who came before me with my surname, it is, I'm amazed. My pastor likes to say that the standard ought to be how they were able to do so much with so little, and how we do so little but yet have so much. So there is a challenge that studying the history of people who weren't even regarded as full members of the human family, in fact, not as members of the human family at all, were able to make substantial contributions to the growth and development of this country, and why so little is known. I mean, one of the things that came out this weekend is a story of a man named Antoine, and how he developed an enslaved man. His master gave him cuttings on a pecan tree, and he came up with the first commercially viable pecan varietal called the Centennial, which was hailed at America's birthday at the Exposition of 1876 for its delicacy, its shape, its flavor. And yet we don't even know this enslaved black man's last name. We're lucky to have him to know that his first name was Antoine. But we have major contributions and minor contributions, and yet, because of enslavement, people who certainly deserve the light of day historically may never get it. And we have, again, an opportunity not to solve every problem, but to begin to take steps together down the road of open dialogue and truth to at least make this country a better place.
You know, I think one of the perplexing things about Virginia, too, is Thomas Jefferson. You know, the Declaration of Independence and its very high ideals, you know, it was, again, a document written by a propertied white man for the benefit of propertied white men, which really were the only people that mattered in this fledgling United States. And so, meanwhile, he has a documented, scientifically proven relationship with Sally Hemings. He has children with her. In fact, she and the children are the only slaves that he frees in his will when he dies.
Yes.
So you know, so what a you know, he was a ball of contradictions. You know, we so praise how he helped to establish the narrative of our country and how we see ourselves, how we declared our independence, and yet he still struggled with the fact. He still struggled with the fact that what he believed to be true did not comport with how he was actually living his life. And for those of us just joining the show, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are talking with historian, author, and lecturer C.R. Gibbs. We are talking about enslaved Africans, Virginia, Jamestown, and how that impacts us here today. So your thoughts on Thomas Jefferson, one of the most revered Virginians in all of history?
He is a blizzard of contradictions. It is a wonder how someone who did what you've just described could, in his notes on the state of Virginia, write that male orangutans preferred sex with black women than female orangutans. And for those of you listening, it's in Notes on the State of Virginia. Look between query, I believe it's 14 and 16, and you'll find it. He actually writes it. We don't know how he did the research for something like that, but for a man who is believed to be dedicated to science, he examples of him, again, in Notes on the State of Virginia, or in his full relationship with Benjamin Banneker, seems that this was a man who could not square the humanity of black people with the lofty ideals that he expressed. He went behind, after corresponding with Benjamin Banneker, he goes behind his back and tells one of his associates, I believe it's Joel Barlow, that he thinks the Ellicotts puffed him up. He has a very mediocre mind. And Jefferson says something of a similar nature about Phyllis Wheatley, when at the same time, these two individuals are giving proof of the intellectual capabilities of enslaved Africans. So we wonder how a man, again, who seems to be at the very summit of science and art and education could have these feelings deep within him. He even compared slavery to a fire bell in the night. He predicted that there would be trouble as long as we had slavery in our midst. And yet he seemed awfully reluctant to, if you will, do the right thing. And I understand that he was in financially difficult times. But Gary Wills, in his book, The Negro President, and he's not talking about the 8 or 6 or 10 black presidents, but what he's referring to is the election, I believe it's of 1800, where states that counted their enslaved population, even though it was only 3/5 of a person, were able to leverage that into, if you will, a more powerful majority and help him get elected. And Gary Wills says that Washington called Jefferson a liar and a moral coward, or at least thought he was a liar and a moral coward. What I will be is a little bit more generous and say again, a blizzard of contradictions, an astounding man who at the same time could never yet peek over the horizon of his own racial prejudice to look at the potential that he was wasting in front of his own site at Monticello, day by day by day.
Yeah, they estimated that he, in his lifetime, owned 600 slaves in his lifetime. So colonization, Jefferson was a supporter of the colonization movement. And that hung on, I want to say that hung on for like almost to the turn of the 1900s, almost, buying Liberia. Well, they bought property in Liberia, right? So it's kind of like the answer to the slave issue for the abolitionists was, well, it's not just a matter of freeing the enslaved people because they're incapable of actually functioning without their masters, which is when you really start to dig into history and understand the tropes and the narratives that were in place. It's quite astonishing. And so this idea is that they would free them and then just ship them out of the country.
Francis Scott Key was in favor of colonization, as was Abraham Lincoln, of all people.
I know he was.
And I mean, he had a disastrous dry run in the first years of the war at a place called Île Vache in Haiti. And then they had to send ships to go and get the people back because the people that the President Lincoln had put in charge of the project were, I suppose the young folks might call them shady today. So it is a caution as well as a reminder that even some of our most highly esteemed heroes, when looked at fully in the light of history, for example, in his second annual message to Congress, and this is in Batchelor's collection of the papers of Lincoln, he talks about how Lincoln has this idea. He says he's willing to extend slavery to January 1900 if between then and now the South will consider and move on compensated emancipation. Well, that didn't happen. That's, as we used to say in the government, overtaken by events. The war is on, and the only way that's going to end is through force, through bloodshed, of which black soldiers took a significant part. We have a memorial down in Washington, D.C., on the only stop named for an African-American historical place, the African-American Civil War Museum, that has 209,145 names of soldiers, men of African descent, as the Army called them, in more than 100 regiments. And if you walk around to the back of the memorial, there are, in addition to an African-American family, black sailors, and these black sailors from roughly between 18,000 and 20,000 also helped to solve this irrepressible conflict, but even today seldom get their just due.
That is so true because nobody wrote the history. Again, most of history has been written by white men for the edification and the shaping of a narrative that supports what I think we can say is white supremacy in today's environment. You can say that's what it is. The European standard from the very beginning has overlaid everything else. The European writings, philosophy, history has always been the standard by which every other immigrant community has been measured.
Indeed. And for we know this, that in time and time again, whether it was the lynching of Italians, for example, in New Orleans, or Jewish Americans in the Deep South, that there all too often, there seems to be a reversion to this basic cycle of hate and mistrust and stereotype. And again, we've got to fight that. There are people who still can't believe that they're seeing it happen in the 21st century. It's been such a reliable dog whistle for so long in American politics.
It certainly has been. And I think that's one of the things because on the other side of my family, my grandfather came through Ellis Island. He was a WAP without passport or without papers. But it's interesting how some of those immigrants suddenly became white. And so we are going to cut to a break, and I want everybody to join us after our break because we are talking with the very esteemed C.R. Gibbs. He is an author, lecturer, and historian of the African diaspora, and he has written 6 books, and we are going to talk with him more when we return. This is Radio Fairfax.
Radio Fairfax. What you want to hear, where you want to hear it.
Hi, I'm Marianne Metz from The Melody Lingers On Radio Fairfax. Join me in exploring and enjoying the Great American Songbook. We bring back the wonderful voices of Rosemary Clooney, Bing Crosby, Ella Fitzgerald, Judy Garland, and Frank Sinatra, just to name a few. And we hear some who are still singing for us today. So come listen as the melody lingers on.
The Melody Lingers On every Wednesday at 11 a.m. only on Radio Fairfax.
Join Mike Delaney Wednesday evenings at 9 for a weekly meeting with the chairman of the board, a true American Idol, Mr. Francis Albert Sinatra. That's Simply Sinatra, Wednesday nights at 9 only on Radio Fairfax.
Tune in to the music that has shaped America's most dynamic art form called jazz. Join me, Robin Clemens, on Jazz at Club Paradise on Saturdays from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time. Listen in and hear recordings from the legendary masters of jazz and releases from young players who are taking the music forward. Join me, Robin Clemens, Jazz at Club Paradise on Saturdays from 12 to 1 Eastern Standard Time on Radio Fairfax.
Welcome to Isla Earth. To the world at large, global warming is anything but a game. But if you happen to be on the internet, it can be. That's where you'll find a game called Climate Challenge. Produced by the BBC, it lets you be president of the European nations. Your job as Prez is to pass environmental laws and react to crises caused by climate change, all the while staying popular enough with voters to remain in office. The data driving the game are actual climate change projections from 2006, provided by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and most of the policies players can work with came from real government policy documents. But the producers of the climate change game want to make sure people know it wasn't meant to accurately predict future events related to global warming. Their goal was to provide players with a fun and challenging way to learn more about the impact of climate change and options governments have for dealing with it. So next time you're online, why not give it a try? With all the insights you'll gain by playing, there's no way you won't be a winner. And the Earth, too. Plug in and play by following discovery links for today's program at islaearth.org. Isla Earth is produced by the Catalina Island Conservancy with support from its Fund for a Sustainable Planet, because Earth is an island.
Keeping the First Amendment alive. We are Radio Fairfax, Fairfax County's public access and internet radio station. Keeping the First Amendment alive.
Welcome to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight my guest is C.R. Gibbs. He's an author, lecturer, and historian of the African diaspora. Tonight we're talking about Jamestown and the arc from the first enslaved people that were brought here in 1619 up to today's issue of mass incarceration. And that is a long arc. And it seems like every time we think we've solved the problem, it turns into something else. So after the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, suddenly, supposedly, now all of these enslaved people are free. But that's not really true, is it?
No, when we look at in fact, I take and I'll do this in a lecture I have coming up next Wednesday at the Woodridge Library in the District of Columbia called A Matter of Injustice, Mass Incarceration and Its Effects on the African American Family. We're watching the roots of mass incarceration. We're tracing them further and further back. Traditional historians have said, well, okay, we've got Nixon's war on drugs, or we've got the omnibus crime bill that came out of the Clinton era. But we're finding that we can work back on this theme further and further back. Reconstruction was an opportunity to test America, and perhaps the ideals stressed reconciliation. White America didn't really want that. They wanted things the way they had been. And we find this, not only do we find actual statements like this in the literature of the time, but when the District of Columbia, for example, lost the vote, there was a Southern senator, John Tyler Morgan, who under the Capitol dome said that we don't want to go along with these people. He and a fellow senator compared taking the vote away from whites so blacks could not have any access to it, burning down a barn to kill all the rats. So, and he was a ex-Confederate general, former leader of the Klan, but this is what he felt comfortable in saying inside the U.S. Capitol building just a couple of decades after the end of the Civil War. But there were those who had hoped that Reconstruction, even in Virginia, could be a time of racial comity and understanding, and it was. The idea of black people in charge was so upsetting, even though we're getting the public school system essentially in the South dates from this period, from the dedicated efforts of newly enfranchised legislators, as well as some who were already freed, to have an equal access to education to all the children, regardless of color. And that essentially dies, and what replaces it is a Jim Crow school system. So it seems as though when the opportunities are presented to have America comport with its stated goals and ideals, the citizenry often is a little lacking if it requires too much social change.
So yeah, that 40 acres and a mule didn't work out exactly as planned. And and I think we should interject here, because you mentioned it briefly before, the plight of the indigenous people was horrific as well. They were marched off their lands, the Trail of Tears, Wounded Knee. It was genocide flat out. So at the time that we're now dealing with the end of the Civil War, the emancipation, the freeing of all of these enslaved people, you've also got struggling indigenous people. And in all of this, you keep electing leaders who try to create policies that on the face of them seem to be, I don't want to say egalitarian. They seem to be fair, but they're not. And they overlook the fact that, in our federal government, you have federal laws, and then you have states' rights, right? So so they're allowing states to make their own laws. So the federal government only has purview over certain kinds of policy. Mm-hmm. And then the rest falls to legislators that are still dominated by segregationists. And segregationists right up to George Wallace, This has gone on. Segregationists right up to today. Who are we kidding here? So on the face of it, it's hard to detect what is happening. But even Brown versus the Board of Education, it led to massive resistance. Again, coming back to Virginia, Prince Edward County closed their public school system. They started a white academy in Farmville that was funded by taxpayer dollars for a whites-only private academy. Like, nobody's teaching this. But for 5 years, which is a whole generation of students who should have been in high school, they were denied an education in Virginia. Where's the reparations for that?
We're looking at massive resistance is essentially a thumb in the eye of the federal authorities. It is a clear statement that even in the 20th century, there are those minds who are shackled to the 19th and the folk ways and sociology of the 19th century, indeed of the 18th century. It presents a conundrum. It at the same time shows that change is going to be difficult. It will take a long time. And this is why people today are wondering, revolution, colonization, many of the things that we thought we would never hear again are coming back on the table, Catherine. So as people look around in frustration, the optimism that existed briefly as a candle flame during the Obama administration has been blown out. It sounds really nice to say when they go low, we go high. But if somebody has a gun on you or is shutting a door in your face, not quite sure that going low is what's needed. So we've got to come up with strategies that are inclusive and at the same time based on truth and a knowledge of this history that reminds us that, once again, we're not as far along the path as we thought we were.
And I don't know why this popped into my head, but there was a law that was passed in South Carolina prior to the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. There was a law that passed that said enslaved women had no rights whatsoever to their children. Mm-hmm. No rights. Like, you may have given birth to this child, you have zero rights to this child. Then you look at the migrant situation we have with the government ripping children away from their families, and now they want to pass an executive order that says you can hold those children now indefinitely. It's like the Indian schools when they took the Indian children away from their native families and put them into schools to make them white. I'm like, how can history keep repeating itself? So it's just such a bald-faced sort of thing. How can we not recognize what this is?
And once again, we have to put the feet of the blame at the feet, rather, of parents who won't tell their children the truth. And many of these stories are known inside families, but the families aren't going to share that. We can't look to very many schools, it seems, to really tell the truth. And yet we must confront this legacy, this negative legacy, if you will, if we're ever going to get to where we need to be. For example, in Washington, I mentioned to you about when they took the vote. So they took the vote from white folk and black people to make sure that black people would never have strong political strength. Now, again, this is the nation's capital. If it could happen in Washington, D.C., it could certainly happen any place else, and certainly in the states of the former Confederacy. I think that without I mentioned John Hope Franklin's lecture, a statement that we need to tell the unvarnished truth, no matter how difficult, no matter how challenging. And we are bound and duty to try and do better than previous generations. After all, most of us consider ourselves so much better, so much improved over the individuals of the past that some of us have looked down on them as rather slow and benighted. But we find, again, that we are not as far along as we should be. And I propose that in the lecture series that I've been doing, we've been doing this lecture series now throughout the DMV since 1989. We would love to have more people come. We have lecture, we'll travel, but we've got to do more than what's being done now. And we can't simply rely on the schools or the churches. We've got to make a personal commitment. If you believe in justice, and whether Dr. King said that the moral arc of the universe is long and it bends toward justice, or whether someone else who came before him said it, it's still a truism. But we've got to make the effort.
I agree, because without optimism, we have nothing. Without hope, we really don't have any place left to go. For those of you just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is author, lecturer, and historian C.R. Gibbs. And I want to put a shout out, portofharlem.net /C Gibbs is where you can find the remaining lectures for his 2019 lecture series. Some of them quite excellent. The one on mass incarceration and its effects on the African American family is coming up this Wednesday, this upcoming Wednesday. Veterans Day weekend, Black Women of World War I and II at the Alexandria Black History Museum. That's one I am particularly interested in. And then November 19th, From Jamestown to Freedom, 1619 to 2019 at the Greenbelt Library. So if you want to hear more from historian C.R. Gibbs, there's many opportunities to do that. And as he said, he has lecture, will travel. And I really think that's what we need is scholars who've done research and are looking at factual representations of what happened in this country to audiences who are eager to hear the history that they are totally unaware of. I want to go back, when we talk about mass incarceration, to what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation, after the Civil War, when local sheriffs started rounding up freed black men and putting them in jail for loitering or vagrancy or looking the wrong way at a white woman. And what they did was then they hired them out to plantations, to road crews, to governments. They built dams and bridges and roads. They worked these people to death. They worked in mines. And that's not history you ever hear anyone talking about, is the convict labor that was actually freed black men gathered up literally on the streets. And we're still doing that today because there are still convicts. I think about the firefighters who fought fires in California for like $2 a day alongside professional firefighters. You know, how can a system that was created post-Civil War be a system we still have in 2019?
It's an extension of an even older system. When people say, well, you can't trace mass incarceration back, we have features of the modern day jurisprudence or criminal justice system that we can take back to the time of slavery, and convict leasing is one of them. So there was an individual in D.C., and for those of you that know the area, I'm talking about D.C.'s most notorious slave jailer. His name was William H. Williams. His slave pen was on 7th Street, off the mall, in what is now occupied by the FAA building. Luckily, they have finally put a wayside exhibit up there. In 1840, William H. Williams decided that he was going to take convict leasing to a whole new level. 1840, he buys 27 black men, women, and children from the Virginia Penitentiary. And he says he's going to ship them to New Orleans. There's some issues about coastwise trade and what have you. But what he's done is graft onto a system of convict leasing. He simply helps spread it out around the country. He also tells people that his ultimate objective is to take these convicts to Texas, which was not yet an American state, but was on the way to becoming one. And so when people look at what this man out of the nation's capital was going to, in fact, he was such a supporter of bringing in Texas as a slave state that Catherine, he flew a flag from the parapets of his slave jail right off the mall that said Polk and Dallas. So we're talking about President Polk and his vice president. I mean, he wanted to make it clear that he was making a pro-slavery statement. And we look at this and we look at the durability, shall we say, of convict leasing, and that is a feature of it that we see horribly returning after the Civil War. But this involved moving black men, women, and children, oftentimes convicted under the flimsiest of evidence. You say, well, how can you say that? Because when we look at exonerations, they're almost non-existent from the period of slavery all the way down to the 1930s. Exonerations are extremely rare, even when there is stated evidence to indicate profound skepticism about the ultimate decision. It's just, and we understand that something had to be done. An example must be made. And so all too often and disproportionately, that example was of a black prisoner who would then be incarcerated, say, for example, the Virginia Penitentiary. And prior to the Civil War, that person, if they were not executed, the state of Virginia would sell them to slave traders who then sent them to another part of the United States. I mean, it's just an infernal system.
Yeah, and I mean, so let's talk about some of the books. You have written books. I think 2 books that leap to mind that people should read if they're truly interested in knowing more about this connection with mass incarceration is Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson and The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, because it really ties in both history to what is happening with the over-incarceration of the black community in our prisons across the country. But you have written 6 different books. Talk a little bit about what some of these books are and the subjects that you cover in them.
Well, I think that one of the ones that has gained the largest interest is Black Georgetown Remembered. I co-wrote that book with Professor Kathleen Lesko and Professor Valerie Babb, and it's the first modern history of the African-American community in one of the best-known neighborhoods in the nation's capital, which is Georgetown, the seat of a university. I mean, it was shocking to learn that history has a way of coming back and biting you in the posterior. And when we found that the university would accept enslaved black people as tuition, and that in order to save the university, one of the largest slave sales in the history of American society took place in the 1830s when more than 200, again, men, women, and children were sold by the university. And that sale helped to save Georgetown College, now Georgetown University. There is a skein of suffering and discrimination that the university for many years didn't wish to talk about. And yet, so Black Georgetown Remembered talks about the difficult existence of black people that lived in the neighborhood of the university and their struggles for an independent, self-reliant community. I'm also very gratified by my book, Black Inventors from Africa to America, because it shows that we didn't learn everything we needed to know just from coming here, that we were inventors and innovators back in Mother Africa. Black Explorers, 2300 BC to the present. I'm still unaware of a particular book that takes such a far back look at the involvement of the independent exploration of Africa by Africans themselves, which makes sense since nobody knows your front room, your living room like you do. But also the involvement of African people, not just of Toten and Fetchers, but also people who wanted to see on their own what was around the next corner or on the other side of the next mountain.
So for those of you just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me this evening is C.R. Gibbs, an author, lecturer, and historian of the African diaspora. Here on Radio Fairfax, we like to bring people on who are, in fact, making change. And in this case, C.R. Gibbs is helping to change our perspective on how we see the history of Black Americans. You know, I love that February is Black History Month, but you know, Black history is American history. Full stop. And that's really 12 months of the year. But I love the fact that you are trying to make this history more accessible through your lecture series, through the books that you're writing. I know that you are a guest lecturer. You are a panelist at conferences. You've got a conference coming up, I believe.
It's actually at the University of Maryland. It is in October. The middle of October. I'm one of 3 speakers. It's sponsored by the 40th National Conference of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. We call it AAHGS, AAHGS. Just go to the AAHGS website and they'll provide more information. I'll be talking, interestingly enough, about 1619 and weaving together the threads of the 1619 experience and the history of African Americans, as well as the importance of history in African society. So that, again, this is nothing we had to learn when we got here. In many respects, we never, ever needed to come here. We had complete systems and societies before we came here, and more people might be gratified to learn a little bit more about the functioning of traditional African societies. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the context of Jamestown, in the context of Black history, at the 40th National Conference, which will be at the College Park Marriott and Conference Center at the campus of the University of Maryland in Hyattsville in mid-October.
So speaking of genealogy, the explosion of DNA testing. So this has also added this amazing spin because, there were... So Thomas Jefferson, let's go back to him. Sally Hemings was his wife's half-sister. So his wife's father also fathered Sally Hemings, which is why she probably looked remarkably like his deceased wife.
Absolutely.
And there were a lot of those families, down in Georgia. Author Karen Brannon has written a book, The Family Tree, and she discovered her Black family. And so they've done DNA testing. They've done a lot of events down in Hamilton, Georgia, where her family, it was her grandfather, great-grandfather were sheriffs down there. And so she's led this whole reconciliation movement with her Black family in Georgia. So my daughter, who works in Richmond, has a coworker that I was talking to who's African American. She said she did her DNA testing, and this is in Virginia. I love Virginia. I'm a native, but she's like, we discovered we had all this family in the county next door, and you know something? She says they're all white. So they were all having a family reunion together, I think in Las Vegas. But to me, it was like, this is amazing that you have this two branches of this family, the Black branch of the family and the white, and they discover each other in adjoining counties in Virginia and decide to have a family reunion, which I understand is what takes place at Monticello now with Jefferson's descendants as well. Do you see, as people voluntarily do DNA testing, that they are going to be more open to the idea that our family is far more inclusive and wide-ranging than we believe it is?
We have a lot more that unites us than divides us. We are closer genealogically than we might think. And if we can get people to surmount that with, again, an honest look. People often ask me, well, Gibbs, where do you start this thing? And I say, some of us are old enough to remember when we had our high school pictures. And one of the first things we did when we got the photograph back is we looked for ourselves in that high school photograph. But we also took time to look for our friends. I'm suggesting that in the family experience, you situate yourself, but be aware and open to the fact that that picture's incomplete, that there just might be a knock on the door or an email or Facebook. Notice that, guess what? You have another side of the family that you didn't know. And don't shut yourself off. When I was researching Black explorers, 2300 BC to the present, we got into the issue of Matthew Henson had an Inuit son, Anakau Henson. We sometimes call the Inuits Eskimos, not a good term. And so did Admiral Peary. But the reception, the positive reception, came from the African-American members of Matthew Henson, who welcomed Anakau into the family at a reunion in Charles County, Maryland, in, I think, about 1986 or so. And it shows you what can be done with a little bit of that love that people say they're willing to have for folk that look like them, that might be transferable to folk who don't, when you share the same blood. That is the potential for a bridge to be built that can make us closer together. Again, we cannot escape the inevitable fact that there is more that unites us than divides us. Instead of concentrating on the differences, let's look at the similarities.
And that is a great closing thought to have, that we are all part of the family of humanity. And if we could open ourselves to see that we're all riding this little planet together, that we are fellow human beings, and that we need to have each other's backs, because our survival depends on making sure that everybody comes along. When we all succeed, it's better for everyone. There cannot, you know the quote, there can't be justice for everyone if there's injustice. What is
Yeah,
that?
or Dr. King and others uses
Yes.
it, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
That's it. And that's what I want people to remember as you go through your day and you look at the people around you. Do we have justice for everyone? And if we don't have justice for everyone, how are we going to change that? Because it's incumbent on each of us to be that change, as Gandhi said, be the change. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
C.R. Gibbs. This has been wonderful. Thanks to all of you for joining us here on Making Change Radio.